Okay, hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join me tonight. I am so very honored that you've canceled all your travel plans, overseas trips, dinner parties, and social affairs just so you could attend tonight's webinar. My name is Aaron. I am the founder of the Lion, and as you can see, I am doing my best to recreate the business class experience in the comfort of my home. I've got my comfortable seat, my glass of wine, and unfortunately, my wife refuses to wear the kabaya I bought her or give me a full body TSA pat down, so this is as good as it gets. I'm going to introduce some of our panelists shortly, but just first a couple of housekeeping matters for those of you who have not used Zoom before, or perhaps you have. You guys should know the drill. The questions tab is for asking questions. The chat tab is for discussions, like how dreamy the panelists are or how the moderator really needs to trim his nose hair. If you ask questions in the chat, they're liable to get lost. If you hold discussions in the questions tab, you're liable to get kicked out. Right? We, of course, welcome questions, so please keep sending them in. If it's relevant to what we're talking about, I'll try and bring it into the discussion. If not, we'll see how many we can answer by the end. Now, tonight we have about 580 participants registered, but only space for about 100 in the webinar room. I did set up a separate live stream on Facebook, but I have no idea whether it's working right now. I hope it is. It may not be. If you're unable to get in, please join the Lions Facebook group and look the link there instead. I will do my best to try and monitor questions from both Zoom and Facebook, but do keep in mind with Facebook Live, it's not quite live. There is actually a 30-second delay. So just a quick sound check in the chat. Can I just confirm everyone's able to hear me adequately well? Yes, no? Fantastic. 2 people can hear me, and that's good enough. So I don't think I need to do a whole lot of table setting here, right? Because everyone knows what's going on. COVID-19 has wreaked complete havoc on the airline industry. Not a day goes by that you don't read about another bailout or bankruptcy. I mean, we've seen Virgin Australia and Avianca go into bankruptcy protection, Virgin Atlantic and the other large US carriers begging for bailouts, and closer to home, even Singapore Airlines getting a $13 billion lifeline courtesy of Temasek. And that's nothing to say about the dozens of other airlines on life support, and I'm sure we haven't seen the last of the changes yet. And if you're a frequent flyer who's been watching your miles balance, I'm sorry, I've just been told that the Facebook Live thing has just gone off. Could you just give me 1 second? I'm just going to try to restart it one more time. And if it doesn't work, we're just going to leave it there. I've got a good feeling about this one. 1 second. Okay, I'm going to go live in the page that I manage. All right. And it's loading the live stream. So once we go on there, we'll be able to continue. Filler words, filler words, filler words. Oh, lovely, it's working. Live now. There we go. And go live. Go live anyway. Okay, great. Facebook Live is working, incredible. So I'm gonna come back here. Yeah, so if you're a frequent flyer who's been watching your miles balance sit idle right now, I think there are 3 questions on your mind. First of all, are my miles safe, right? Will we see devaluations? Are airlines going to take the sword to their frequent flyer programs when all this is over? Second, what does it mean if the airline doesn't even survive this crisis, right? What does it mean for my hard-earned miles and for award tickets that have not even flown yet? Third, what can frequent flyers do to protect themselves during this period? Can they even do anything at all? These are all really, really important questions, and I'm delighted to have with me tonight Mark and Nik. Mark is the head of strategy and partnerships at Ascenda, a loyalty solutions company. Nik is the director at Leopard Loyalty, a loyalty consulting firm. Gentlemen, good evening. Thank you for joining. Could I get Mark first and then Nik to say a few words about themselves so we can get to know you guys better?
Sure. Thanks, Aaron, and thanks for having us on. I think it's great to have the opportunity to talk about miles and at least spend a little time on something we enjoy so much since we can't be flying. A little bit about me. I've been doing miles, various things related to the miles industry since about 1999, when I discovered that if you flew domestically in the US for long enough distance at a cheap enough price, you could earn so many miles that you could fly more for free. And that was really the start for me. It was a mileage running thing and a personal hobby. I got into the industry a few years later when I moved to Singapore, and I worked for Amex, running various loyalty related products for them, and then founded my own loyalty consulting company, which was acquired by Ascenda last year. So Ascenda basically helps banks build great loyalty and rewards programs. So we are the technology behind some of the credit card partnerships you all know and love, that allow you to transfer your miles, that allow you to book using points and all of those various things. We work with companies around the world. We're headquartered here in Singapore, where I am at the moment, and for the foreseeable future.
Great, great, thank you. Nik, your turn.
Yeah, hi, Nik Laming. I'm another loyalty guy. I fell into the industry in London in '98, working for a company called Carlson Marketing, which was absorbed into AMIA. I had various roles with them in London, and then Australia, and then Singapore, running Asia for them. I moved from there to design and manage a loyalty program for a conglomerate here in Manila, Philippines, which is where I am today. As of the end of January, I set up my own consulting business called Leopard, which has the sole intent of helping organizations create, manage loyalty programs, data monetization programs, and digital and data businesses. So they're getting better value from the assets that they have. So yeah, loyalty geek. I've been a member, an architect, a manager, and probably a victim of many loyalty programs. So.
Yeah, aren't we all? Yeah, thanks, guys. So look, I mean, I'm just gonna start us off with this. And apologies, I think this slide should come with a trigger warning, because seeing these banners is kind of the stuff of nightmares for many a miles chaser, right? So airlines announced changes to the loyalty program, which kind of goes to show that enhancements are a matter of perspective. Conventional wisdom goes that airlines are going to have a field day devaluing miles due to the COVID-19 downturn, because miles are kind of like a funny money that they have complete control over. So my question for Mark and Nik is this. Could you maybe first and foremost explain the economics that go on behind loyalty program devaluations? Why do airlines devalue miles, and how or does it even improve their financial position?
How many hours do we have?
One, give or take.
Nik, you've probably got a better executive summary than I do. You've perfected this over the years.
So loyalty programs are both assets and liabilities for airlines. And the basic economics are that every mile or point that gets earned goes on to the airline balance sheet as a deferred revenue or a deferred liability. And then that sits on the balance sheet until such time that the point or mile is used, either through redemption or breakage. So what you end up with is a huge amount of deferred revenue sitting on the balance sheet of an airline. And that has a valuation that's based on the value of an individual mile multiplied by the number of miles there are with members. So essentially what the airline owes members in the future, less an allowance for breakage. But the reason that you devalue a loyalty program redemption is essentially to reduce your cost of redemption per point. What that means is that if you can reduce your cost of redemption by say 10%, and you've got $100 million of deferred revenue, or liability sitting on your balance sheet, then if you can prove to the auditor that the value of that liability now shouldn't be 100 million, but you've reduced your cost per point by 10%, so you can take 10 million out into revenue, into your P&L, and only keep 90 million against the future revenue or liability. So, and if it's being run properly, there should also be a big load of cash sitting on the balance sheet to service that future liability. So you can also take $10 million from that cash reserve and again feed it into your business. So there could and should be both a balance sheet impact in a positive way because you're reducing your deferred liability, a P&L impact because you're able to release revenue from the balance sheet into the P&L, and a cash impact because you're able to release cash from the trust into the business for other purposes. So in short, that's a fairly complicated or a simplified view of a very complicated topic.
Yeah. So if all this is sitting as a liability on their balance sheet, right? I guess it stands to reason that if they do a devaluation, there's less of a liability. They can recognize some additional revenue. But does it follow also? I mean, does it cut both ways, right? Because they are making money from selling these miles to banks, right? They're saying that the partners selling to the banks. So does it stand to reason that if you do a devaluation, yes, you do reduce that liability, but in the future, when you sell the points to banks, does it come back to bite you in that sense?
So I think so. It's not a simple equation necessarily, but the thing is, they've built this very strong revenue stream based on the promise of future results and the ability to redeem those miles. So people have occasionally referred to the whole miles game as a Ponzi scheme and all of these things. If the devaluation goes too deep and if consumers lose confidence, then some of those revenue streams do go away. But I think there's another really important point here when we talk about whether airlines will devalue their miles. It's not really the airline's money in a lot of cases. So I think programs are structured differently in different markets. You have some programs where they're really a division of the airline, and unfortunately, KrisFlyer and Singapore Airlines is one of those. You have other carriers where it's a completely arm's length program, looking at Avios in BA and Executive Club. They're separated completely in terms of legal entities. Virgin Velocity was very much separated from Virgin Australia. And in those situations, it's not as simple as the airline dipping its hand into the cookie jar of the loyalty program, because there should be governance and constraints that don't allow that to happen. So I think there's a little bit of a separation there in terms of what devaluation does for the airline versus what it may do for the loyalty program. That's also important to consider.
Yeah, I think the other thing, so it's interesting that you mentioned that there's kind of like a check and balance against too much devaluation, and one of those checks and balances may be that it's a separate legal entity. But I'm thinking from the bank's point of view, right? If I'm going to buy 100 million or even more than that credit card points, miles from you to give out to my customers, do those contracts typically build in some sort of protection for the bank? Because last thing you want to do is buy a whole lot of miles, and then tomorrow the airline says, okay, they're worth 20% less, and all of a sudden your customers don't want them.
I think that the first thing to bear in mind is that the person the person normally making this decision, and I think these things are cyclical, is the CFO. Because what happens is everyone gets very excited. There's a new CMO or head of loyalty, and they create this wonderful program, and they put lots of value in it for the customers. They have a fight with revenue management, and they get lots of good fares, and they're running their program very, very happily. And then the CFO starts to see this really big number on the P&L and the balance sheet, all these rewards going out of my from externally in cash, and And what's this huge number on my balance sheet? Well, a really easy way to correct that is just to devalue. So I think often these devaluation decisions are CFO decisions, and as such, the airline, the loyalty program, very rarely has much control over that, unless it's a very, very separate and independent entity. And the banks would have even less. I don't think any airline would give protection to a bank against devaluing redemption. Redemption is at the sole discretion of the airline, and it's a risk that the bank takes when going into it. And the reason that you don't tend to devalue is that members don't like it. They really don't like it. And I had a conversation with a guy who was running a loyalty program, a big one in Australia. And he very proudly said that, look, we've devalued 5 times or something in the last 5 years, and it's had no impact on our numbers. And I saw that as one of the worst things that he could possibly have said, because it essentially meant that their program had so much value ripped out of it that customers just didn't care about it anymore. It wasn't relevant, and it wasn't delivering enough value for them to respond and do the things that we want them to do. So there is a big incentive for airlines to keep value in their program, but they need to be financially healthy, or you need a structure that protect the loyalty program from the sort of cash hoover that an airline is.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting that you kind of talked about how one of the checks and balances is that if you do it too much, the customers go away. But I've always thought that's kind of interesting, because for people like you and me, and probably most of the people listening in, I mean, we're all big miles and points junkies. We follow this obsessively. We know when the airline so much as makes a change to a typo on their website. But we're outliers, to be frank. And the vast majority of your loyalty program members probably aren't that engaged. So do you have a situation where you've got like 80% of the program is kind of disengaged? They don't really check their balances that often. And at the end of the day, you get all these people when there's a devaluation saying, that's it, I'm out, I'm gonna leave. But they're back again in like 12 months. So do people really follow through? I mean, do you actually see a discernible change in engagement after a program devalues?
I think you're talking on sort of 2 different levels there. I think you nailed it when you said that people just give up on it and they're not engaged in it anymore. So you say, look, take this fantastic offer that I have, and there's a points incentive, and they ignore you. So then your loyalty program is just a cost, because you're not getting any behavioral change out of it, and you're not able to really use it as an incentive. They're not going to leave, because unless it's a paid program, they're going to stay in it.
Yeah.
But they're just going to be less inclined or less attached, less of an affiliation with your brand. And it depends how deep you go and what changes you make. And people will have a tantrum. They'll say, I will never fly you again.
Yeah.
And then within 6 months, they're back. And they're coming and saying, look, can I get a status upgrade? I think that there are other elements as well in play here. It's not just about miles and points and a conversion rate. They're very rational things. It is about, look, jump the line, get in that red carpet queue that's exclusive for the premium flyers and so on. So there is a balance of kind of rational and emotional things in here. But I think you do need to be careful about the underlying value of earn and burn, because if you play with it too much, then you get a whole bunch of people just switching off. So it's not really about them leaving you, it's more about them switching off, and then you're wasting your money in investing in this program.
I think a couple points to follow on with that, Aaron. Your comment around the banks having negotiated co-brand deals, this was always something the banks tried for, was some kind of a guarantee that they weren't going to sign a 7-year contract and then suddenly find the program had no value, the next week or the next month. It always came up in discussions. Very few times did banks get anything that they really wanted with that, but occasionally you might see some form of a clause that says they can't devalue more than a certain amount. I mean, they can't suspend the program in a worst case example. Following on Nik's point, though, I think the other thing about the cycle, and I completely agree with that cycle. The CFO is the last person to be convinced and the first person to try to take away the cash. I don't think we're going into that segment of the cycle. If we look at the devaluations that we've seen, and we look at when the CMO wins versus the CFO, there's actually a very strong case to be made for the critical importance of marketing initiatives coming out of a downturn like this. One of the things that we spend our time looking at very closely, because of all the links we have in the travel industry and the banking industry, is, where will the opportunities start to come? What is consumer sentiment? All of these pieces, because we want to know how much business there will be out there in the future, just like everybody else. It seems that consumers are itchy to travel. I don't have to tell this audience. I mean, I know everybody here is. But it seems like that's a pretty common sentiment across Europe, which is gradually opening up, across Asia. The travel may not be the long-haul luxury travel, but at least domestic in China, locally in Europe, that seems to be what people want. And that's going to be the time when those airlines that survive, whichever ones they are going to be figuring out how to put as many butts in seats as they can, given whatever constraints are in place in their local markets. It's not the time to be seen negatively and to be cutting back on the perception of value, because frankly, I don't think they're going to be in a situation where there are too many people chasing too few seats. I think it's going to be that they've got capacity. What better time to give away redemptions than when they're not displacing revenue seats?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you think about more of a general trend, right? We are going to talk specifically about one very important airline for most people in just a bit. But if I ask you guys to do some crystal ball gazing, what do you think we're going to see over the next 6 to 12 months as borders slowly open up, some travel starts coming back? I mean, are we going to see things like maybe more airlines shifting to revenue-based redemptions? Do we need to be worried about the infamous pump and dump, right? I mean, just the other week, Air Canada Aeroplan was doing this amazing large mile sale, almost too good to be true. So many people were saying like, okay, so here's the plan, right? They're just gonna sell a buttload of miles, and 6 months later, the other boot's gonna drop. So I think this is what people are worried about, right? Pump and dump schemes, revenue-based redemptions, or even things like soft devaluations. Maybe we don't change the award chart, but maybe we just make it, we just increase the co-pays in terms of fuel surcharges, or we increase the fees to change or cancel a ticket, stuff like that. What do you guys think is going to happen?
I think the beauty of loyalty programs, and again, just to follow on from what Mark was saying, is that you're actually giving away something that costs you virtually nothing. You've got a slight incremental fuel burn. You may have a meal that you're giving away, but it really doesn't cost very much at all. So you've got huge potential to attract large parts of the audience back who are very price sensitive and may not wish to fly and spend lots of money within the next 6 to 12 months, but may be very happy to use points that they've accumulated to get a seat on the plane, and maybe a business class or one of the upper class cabins as well, and really treat themselves, because the airlines can give enormous value to their loyalty programs in these times. If they're running at 95% full, then it's a much, much harder argument. But they're clearly not going to be. And big parts of the population are going to be not interested really in spending large amounts of money to travel. And I think it will be large amounts of money to travel with most airlines, because they can only sustain promotions for so long. They're going to want to generate a lot of cash. And they're also going to want to be profitable on every flight. And it's going to be hard with the volume of passengers going down, at least initially. So I think that loyalty programs represent, if they're used sensibly and well, they represent a real opportunity to cement relationships and actually get incremental flights, albeit they're not cash generating, but they're still releasing revenue. So I think that we should see much smarter use of loyalty programs, not devaluing. If anything, I'd up their value, because why not? It cost me the same. So I'd rather cement people and get people flying again than devalue and put them off in these really sensitive times.
If we look back at the history of previous industry crises, 2001 in the US, the global financial crisis, what we typically saw was that a lot of airlines actually aggressively are marketing for share at that point, because everybody's coming out of a downturn together. The ones who are the most aggressive in accelerating out of that have the opportunity to make share gains. And I think when you look at something like what Qatar has done this week, the flexibility policies have two purposes, right? One is peace of mind, but the other is it's the most flexible will win. If they're giving away a free change to you that helps you, they're not displacing a seat, as Nik pointed out. The load factors aren't going to be there. So they're giving something that has no cost. And actually, that's a loyalty initiative in its own way as well. So I think the airlines are really jockeying for what they can get out of this at the end. And so loyalty is actually a more important tool than ever.
I think there is one area, though, that is going to get devalued massively, and that is non-air rewards. Because non-air rewards were born out of airlines sold millions and millions and millions of miles and points to banks. Those hit customers' points balances, and suddenly they didn't have enough capacity to give away the free flights anymore. So they looked for other avenues for people to burn their miles and their points. And they introduced big catalogues of non-air rewards, which were reasonable value. They were kind of equivalent to a credit card program. So that was fine when 20% of your rewards, maybe max, were going to these external rewards, because that's cash out. So the airline has to write a check to the retailer or the cinema or wherever their points or miles are being used. That's fine when you're flying, but when you're not flying, the 20% becomes 100%. So suddenly all of your redemption is cash out. And that put the fear into a lot of CFOs rather, when they're trying to conserve cash, and suddenly there's the potential for their whole liability in points of miles to evacuate from the business and go cash out to a retailer. So I think that model will definitely be looked at. I don't think they'll be removed entirely, but I think there's been studies that have shown that you get 10 times the value or something from a flight versus these external rewards. But I do believe that there will be some changes off the back of this, because nobody had built their programs on a financial model that said 100% of redemption is going to be coming from non-air rewards. It just simply wasn't a scenario that anyone thought about.
But doesn't it also stand to reason that in this time where people can't really use their miles to fly, if I'm an airline and I want to keep people engaged in my program and I can't offer them flights, won't I need to expand the non-air redemptions? Otherwise, why would people want to earn my miles?
It's a problem. It's a definite problem. If you do want to expand, but there's a financial cost to that. We'd all want the airlines to be flying full schedules right now too, and that's not possible. I really think Nik's point is absolutely right. The difference between the cost of a redemption on the carrier and the cash out cost to the airlines, or to the programs, excuse me, we're talking about, a 90 to 95% difference in what $100 value to the consumer would cost the airline, the program. I keep conflating these. I'm trying to be careful not to. No program can survive that for long. So if you look at what Velocity did in Australia, the first thing they did when Virgin Australia went into administration was they shut down all the redemptions for 4 weeks. It's like a cooling off period. If they had had airline redemptions, I would wager to say the likelihood of shutting those down was a lot less, because those can be accounted for at least between entities in the same business group. But because any redemption that went out the door at that point represented cash, there was too much uncertainty for them to be able to continue those redemptions until the situation clarified. And that's basically the same calculus that every program has to figure out at the moment. Some of them have the cash in trust to weather that for longer than others. But if the shutdown continued and there were no air redemptions available for a long time, these programs simply wouldn't be viable.
Yeah. On that note, I want to pivot to one particularly important airline for most people listening in right now. And I'm going to show you a slide that I'm pretty proud of. It only took me like 4 days to make, right? So here's the story of Singapore Airlines, right? From the time that Chris Flyer was founded back in 1999, all the way until now, right? And I've listed on this timeline some of the key traumatic events for the aviation industry. Of course, in 2001, you've got September 11, then you've got SARS in 2003, you've got the global financial crisis in 2008. Between 11 and 14, the average price of oil is almost $100. And then right now we've got 2020, right? The single largest event to hit the aviation industry in history. And of course, Singapore Airlines' first ever annual loss. Now, here's what's interesting, right? If I plot all the devaluations that Chris Flyer has done, right, it kind of looks like this, right? So initially, the devaluations were kind of like every four to 5 years, kind of a regular pace. And then you've got January 2019 as kind of an outlier because that's barely 2 years. My question is, first of all, is this even drawing a proper correlation? Do we tend to see any link between some major traumatic event for the industry and devaluations? Or am I seeing this whole thing wrong in the first place? Is it more of it's an interval, right? So it's every 2 years, it's every 4 years. What happens in between doesn't really accelerate or decelerate.
I think you maybe need a bit more data. It doesn't seem that it's necessarily linked to events. To our point earlier, I'd be looking at who the CFO was, who the CEO was, who was running the loyalty program, and were there changes in or before those periods? Because I think that they don't look particularly related to the crisis. They preempted the financial crisis. After SARS there was one, but I wonder whether it's other things that are actually driving it.
Yeah, I mean, I had another one where we kind of looked at the financials. And of course, you know, in 2020, it's the first year they've ever recorded a loss. I mean, I do think it's like a pretty valid point that if anything, this is probably the best time to double down on the loyalty program since the opportunity cost isn't as high. But one interesting thing is we've not actually seen Singapore Airlines selling miles to consumers, right? I'm sure they do a whole lot of volume to the banks. But when you look at what some of the airlines in the US or elsewhere in the world have done, even in Europe, you know, where they practically hold a mile sale every quarter, is there any reason in your mind why Singapore Airlines has historically been kind of adverse to that? They don't really sell miles to the end consumer, at least not in the same way the other airlines do?
I think it's probably the same reason that you'll never get an upgrade on Singapore Airlines, because they don't need to. I think they have a kind of jewel in the crown of a program, and they look after their best customers and best flyers incredibly well, and I'm sure they want to preserve that. And I think that they're a little bit removed from other airlines out there in that I think that they perhaps don't need to do as aggressive things as selling miles or points to members at very high prices. That they can do it in different ways. So I think Singapore Airlines is kind of a bit shielded from the desperation maybe that we're seeing from some other airlines.
So I would just add to that, that is the historical case. I think, you know, the viewpoint that I have of Singapore Airlines is they've taken a very different commercial strategy regarding loyalty than most of the carriers in the world. And there are many different strategies, but they've chosen one that's relatively more unique in terms of the relative value that they provide to their top tier premium paid business and first class flyers versus what they provide to the rest of us. And as a low tier economy class flyer, until very recently, you earned 0 miles for the promo fares, right? The first admission that there might be something in this strategy of targeting the people who don't always spend $6,000 on a ticket out of Singapore in business class was when they said, okay, 10% miles for the lowest promo fares, right? I mean, it's better than nothing, but it's not exactly significant in terms of really shifting behavior. I think it was more significant in showing that they may be relooking at their philosophy a little bit, that they do see some value now in the back of the plane that they didn't previously. I think there is definitely a lot more consciousness, though, of Singapore Airlines being relatively comfortable with lower load factors, especially in premium cabins, and not comfortable at all with building this ecosystem too big. If they sell miles to absolutely everybody, consumers, credit cards, and they have billions and billions of outstanding miles liabilities, like, say, the US carriers, at some point, too many miles are chasing too few seats. They have to really solve that as a separate problem. And I think they've taken a very conservative approach in terms of adding things like the conversions between other programs in Singapore at fairly conservative rates, and trying to create just enough value to keep the economy class passenger from looking elsewhere, while not really creating enough value to change the fundamental design of the program.
Yeah, and it's I think the other concern that people have is that the longer the fleet remains grounded, and we do know that Singapore Airlines schedule for June is pretty much bare bones. The longer the fleet remains grounded, is it fair to say the longer that inflationary pressure builds up? I mean, we have seen Singapore Airlines taking steps to introduce non-air redemptions in the form of CRISPay, or even more recently, and I mean, I thought this was a great idea. It's just awful timing. KrisFlyer experiences, right? The idea that they're gonna let you redeem your miles for all these money can't buy stuff. So we are kind of seeing that, but I guess I'm also wondering, like, the longer this goes on, theoretically speaking, people haven't stopped earning miles, right? People are still earning miles in their cards. They're still, you know, they still have to spend, and you've got this like thing that needs a pressure release valve. So is it fair to say the longer this goes on, the greater that risk becomes?
I think some of it depends on governance and how the airline is structured versus where the loyalty program sits. In some cases, there is a firewall between the airline and the loyalty program, and in that case, it will be far harder, or there's far less incentive for the airline to devalue, because they want and need more redemption in order to release revenues from the other entity, the loyalty entity. So if that's the situation, then it really doesn't benefit the airline that much to do a devaluation, because you just get less redemption, which means less revenue for the airline from the loyalty entity. However, if it is molded into the airline and it's just treated as another division within the airline, and it's 4 tiers below in terms of where it's managed, then there will be a lot of pressure to use the cash, if it hasn't been used already, and to devalue, because in my mind, that is, how can I say this sensitively? I think well, let me put it this way. For me, the money and the deferred revenue or the liability is actually owed to those members. It's owed to those customers. And when, I think we're going to talk a bit about what happens when airlines go bust later on. But essentially, as a loyalty program member, you are a creditor, and the airline owes you money in kind in the form of a flight or a reward. So they should be protecting that and honouring it and structuring themselves so that they're forced to do so. It's just that many of them haven't, and so I think that's the risk. the Singapore Airlines, again, I think is a slightly different example because they're so well backed. But if I was talking about another, well, I think Thai Airways is probably a good example. I would be very nervous if I was a loyalty program member within Thai Airways at the moment.
Yeah, and
I think your point, Aaron, around the miles spending building up still while there's no outlet and this sort of like bubble is a very valid one, but it reinforces Nik's point that how would somebody like KrisFlyer prefer that they release the pressure in the bubble? They don't want that bubble all going to non-air redemptions that are going to cost them a tremendous amount of money. They want it to go back into the airline where they have a lower cost of redemption. Now, that being said, we've also answered the question of why transfer of points to things like KrisPay is such a poor value. It's because those represent cash out obligations to the airline. So they've basically given the consumer the burden of saying, you know, if you really want to send them out of our ecosystem, then we're not going to give you very good value for that. So it all ties together in that way. And I think for people who are looking at whether KrisFlyer miles continue to be a good value, I would not suggest that it suddenly makes sense to just, you know, use them on retail at KrisPay. I know you've been saying this all along, but you know, the business is not going to go away forever and completely. It looks bleak now, but we're not in that stage.
yeah, so Nik's brought up the case of Thai Airways. So I want to pivot to this other thing, right? Let's talk worst case scenario, right? Between a devaluation or a bankruptcy, I think most frequent flyers would rather the airline devalues, because a bankruptcy, man, it's just a completely other situation. So we're hearing in the news, right? Thai Airways going bankrupt, Virgin as Australia filing for bankruptcy protection. And we have seen it in the past with Jet Airways and Air Berlin going out of business, both of which had fairly established loyalty programs. So can you talk us through what are the scenarios that can happen if an airline goes under? I'm thinking particularly in terms of what happens to your miles, what happens to your partner tickets. How worried should Thai Airways holders, miles holders be right now?
Yeah, I think if we look at those four, there's two good examples and two scary examples. I think that, so Jet Airways, when it went under, the Jet Privilege program survived it. And not only did it survive it, they're continuing and they're trying to transform their business into a more general travel loyalty program and a digital and data business. They have rebranded, they've become Intermiles, they're looking to the future, they're looking to continue to build. Contrast that with Air Berlin. They went bust, and the top bonus program was in a separate entity. But I think it was very soon after the loyalty program filed as well, and was bankrupt, and all of the members became unsecured creditors, and they were offered pennies on the dollar for the value of their miles. And what's caused the difference between those two, for me, is it's not the structure, because they were both separate entities. It's just the fact that one had the cash to continue to run the business as a going concern, and the other didn't. Now, we don't know exactly why Air Berlin didn't have the cash, because 70% of that business is owned by Etihad. But for whatever reason, it wasn't there, and I'm sure that's why they folded. Now, contrast that with the two recent ones, and we can see that Virgin, if I was a Virgin Australia member, I'm not worried, because I've got first-hand experience of how that was set up, and it was set up very well. It was set up as a separate entity. There's a trust, and that trust contains the cash that's going to be used to fund redemption. So as a member, the value of your investment, of what you're owed as an unsecured creditor, should be secure. Now, we don't know how much is in that trust, but providing they don't have a huge run, or they prevent a huge run on that points bank, there's no reason why they shouldn't sustain. And then whatever rises in Virgin's place, whether it's a reinvigoration or a new airline, will come with that loyalty program, and hopefully they'll match the kind of benefits and experience that those members got. So I think that's one that was very well set up from the outset. Thai Airways, on the other hand, scares me. I don't know as much about Thai Airways and the structure, but I certainly don't believe they have a separate management team. I don't know whether they have a separate entity. I doubt it. And I would be very concerned that that will disappear with the airline, because Thai Airways would have sucked every cent of cash from anywhere around the business to try and stay flying. And that would have included all of that liability to those unsecured creditors, loyalty members. So yeah, in two of those cases, I'm not worried. I applaud them. They've done a good job in the face of sort of adversity. And I don't think a devaluation would have saved any of these carriers either. Yeah, that's my perspective on those.
So taking those examples, I mean, I think if you're going to assess the risk, I think, Nik, you've got it exactly right. I do think, though, that this is all relative in one sense, which is these programs often have more value than the airline itself. And we've seen the reports like in the US around American Airlines. The value of the membership base and the data that can be obtained from them is the reason that Intermiles, the former Jet Privilege, is still in business. I mean, it's got airline and travel redemptions, but they're not terribly good value. The reason people are investing still into that program is because the member base and the activity generated was significant enough that people believe there's a financial case. Loyalty is ultimately a data story. We, as the consumers, basically are being bribed to give our data to the program operators in order to let them market to us and others like us more effectively. That's the business story behind loyalty if you want to take it down to its base level. And that story doesn't necessarily go away, even if the airline isn't there as an enabler. So Thai is definitely problematic, but it has been for probably more than a decade. There's plenty of flag carriers that have been in that position, and this may push some of them out of the market. But in any big program that, let's say everybody's under an equal risk of bankruptcy at this point, barring government bailouts, in any larger program, that base may be worth enough that it is safe. And in any program that has those ring fences and trusts that Nik mentioned, then I think doubly so. And I was thinking about this just the past couple of days in preparing for this, the question around what would you do if you had bank points expiring? Would you put them, and I see somebody ask that question, would you put them into poor value gift cards, or would you go ahead and do what you would have done with them in better times and put them into the mileage programs? I wouldn't hesitate to put them into the mileage programs. The risks are exactly what they were before in terms of devaluation. And what we've always said in the industry is don't put things in unless you've got a pretty good idea what you want to do with them. I think that advice still applies. But I don't see a massively elevated level of risk if you've got a reasonably short to medium term plan for what you want to do with those miles. If you're saving 1 million miles for your honeymoon and it's going to be 5 years, I would tell you even a year ago not to have done that miles transfer. But if you're saving for something soon, I think you can get the value. And I don't think a program is going to go completely poof in the amount of time that we're talking about for a miles transfer.
And if the airline does happen to go under, what happens to, say, partner redemption tickets? Because I think what a lot of people are not clear on is how the reimbursement arrangement works. Is it the case that once you redeem, if I'm a Thai Airways holder, I redeem a flight on Singapore Airlines, and Singapore Airlines is paid straight away? Is it rendered after the flight? How does it work?
That's a great and complex question. I don't think even sometimes the airlines know how that works. It's very dependent on the way that the clearing is set up between the airlines, who has done the ticketing of that, whether they're a separate entity functioning like a travel agency, which in the case of Intermiles was what they were doing with Etihad tickets, or whether it's being ticketed by the home carrier. Like if Thai Airways tickets it and Thai Airways isn't there anymore, there's a higher level of risk. It's very difficult to answer that. And I think the big thing is really to know what entity you're dealing with. Do a little bit of due diligence around whether you're dealing with a carrier like United, Mileage Plus is a division of United, or Air Canada Aeroplan, where Aeroplan was completely separate. Sorry, I'm referring back a year now. Because they will have very different outcomes in that scenario. But that being said, any bankruptcy reorganization takes minimum of a few months. It's a very long, arduous process. And if you look at Avianca, they've just gone Chapter 11. Life Miles is not Avianca, first of all. For those who like to use that program for Star Alliance, Life Miles is a separate entity. It's going on. Everything is fine for them. But even if Avianca ceases to exist, it's going to take a year or more for that to happen. So again, it's really about your time horizon in terms of how you think about these decisions. And I'd say these are the same kind of risk analyses you should have been doing even before if you're really serious about this miles game.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And just to qualify that, the question that we were asked was about specifically referring, would you transfer soon to expire credit card points into KrisFlyer? Well, the short answer to that is because it's KrisFlyer, yes, I absolutely would, because they're backing, they're not going to disappear. If you are talking about a small African regional airline that's privately funded, I'd probably have a different answer. And to Mark's point, you do need to do a bit of due diligence, because points are like, they're a currency. And it's a bit like, would you take your savings and would you feel comfortable to put them into Citibank, or would you feel comfortable, or DBS in Singapore, or would you go and find a shady outfit with one branch in a 7-Eleven and put all your money in there and hope for the best? I think it all comes down to how much you're playing with, and as to the level of sort of due diligence that you could or should do. And it depends how much of a geek you are as well. Or some people will do it. And there's one other question in here, which is, will COVID change the future of airline loyalty programs? Personally, I don't think it will. Perhaps there'll be a wrinkle or a bump in the short term, but my perspective is that I don't think it will impact travel in the long term. I don't think it will impact loyalty programs in the long term. And so the only way that it will impact an airline loyalty program is if it sends it bust. So there's really going to be an impact on the Thai Airways loyalty program and the Virgin Australia program. But that's because of a much larger movement in the market than just the loyalty program.
Yeah. And I think we've already kind of talked about a few of these. I think Mark mentioned the Life Miles. I think KrisFlyer is pretty much safe. There are two other programs that quite a few people listening in are probably invested in. The first one is Alaska Mileage Plan. The second one is Cathay Pacific, which amazingly hasn't come out in our discussion at all. If I were to hold miles in either of these two programs, is there anything in particular you'd be advising those people, anything they need to watch out for, to be worried about?
I have a little concern with Mileage Plan. I love the program. So does every blogger on the face of the earth. And that's really where my concern comes from. Knowing that partner redemptions often mean cash out, and the fact that Mileage Plan has a very disproportionate number of partner redemptions. I know they've rationalized these to some extent, but when we talked about devaluation in the very beginning, what we were really talking about was awards on the carrier itself, where they don't have to pay another carrier. I think Alaska is in a position where if they're giving away lots of Asia miles, Cathay Pacific, business and first class seats and lots of Emirates seats based on what everybody knows about their program sweet spots, they may have a little bit of a different financial concern. That being said, I'm not worried about the airline as much. They are fairly well managed. They've come through the merger that they've done in pretty decent shape. They had a rough year or two of integration. They're joining One World, which is quite a huge change for them. That will probably be delayed, I can only guess. But I think the program is safe, the miles are safe. However, partner redemptions may have passed their glory days.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add to that. I think that it's always more complex when you've got cash out, but I think that the model that they've adopted is similar to some of the next or new generation of programs that do have more cash out. And what it does mean is that you need to have the belief, for one, that your program is going to deliver results that warrant the cash out. You need it to be structured so that it can run independently, because if cash is going out of the loyalty business and the cash is in the loyalty business for that purpose, then I don't think anyone's really concerned. But when it's airline and flights, it's quite hard, because there's a vast difference between someone redeeming on your own metal versus someone redeeming on another carrier, where you've got maybe preferential pricing, but you're certainly not in the realms of it costing you just the fuel burn and a meal.
Yeah, and this is interesting, right? Because the issue of partner redemption was brought up. From what I understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong, one of the reasons why quite a few airlines got a bit testy at Life Miles was because Life Miles was selling a lot of miles that most people would never redeem on Avianca. Instead, they were redeeming on, say, like Lufthansa or some other premium cabin product. And the long and short of it is that, sometimes airlines do block award space from certain carriers. But what I was thinking is that, based on what I know, reimbursement rates for partner flights are actually really, really low. So much so that some airlines do find it makes more sense. I'm going to sell all the miles. Even if I sell the miles at a discount, the reimbursement rate that I pay the partner is so low that it still kind of makes sense. Is that really true? I mean, do you understand how the reimbursement model works?
So again, how many hours do we have? There's a balance of payments definitely that comes into play. And I would say that's more true when you talk about Star Alliance. They are the most maniacally coordinated in this. Now, Singapore Airlines doesn't necessarily follow all of the Star Alliance guidelines, but in general, you would find that there is some form of clearinghouse similar to what you have with revenue tickets, whereby these carriers can exchange value a little bit more directly. Alaska would not be typically participating in something like that as an independent. So they probably have bilateral agreements with each of those carriers. So in the Life Miles case, it is possible that they're getting pretty preferential economics out of some of those redemptions. And it's true, the average Miles and More member is much less likely to redeem on Avianca than the average Life Miles member is to redeem on Lufthansa. So that balance of payments may not be in favor, but it can work if the program is designed and set up that way and the CFO is behind it, to Nik's point.
Yeah. Okay, I think we do have time to answer the last and perhaps the most important question before we go over to the audience Q&A. So guys, if you were us, and I'm pretty sure you're in the same position that a lot of us are in right now, what's the game plan now? What's the strategy? What do I do with my card points? What shouldn't I be doing? What's the way forward for most frequent flyers?
I think that the game hasn't changed that much, in that what I should be doing is always what I should be doing, in that I would tend to park my miles or points where I feel that there's a safe harbor. And for me, that's been in a bank program where there's no expiry. However, there's always a danger the bank are going to devalue. So you've kind of got to trade that off. Do I believe it's a good idea at the moment to transfer points into an airline program? Possibly. I think it depends on the airline. Again, if it's KrisFlyer, I would. If it's Philippine Airlines, I'm going to have more question marks. Because I don't know the parent airline will be there in 12 months. But I think that all you can really do is put your currency, put your savings where you feel most comfortable. But I also do believe that there's going to be some great deals that come up as and when the airlines start flying again, because they're going to want to get people redeeming. They're going to want to get them flying. So I think we could see some promotions. And for those who are willing to take the risks, if there are risks, then it may be worth kind of diving in.
I think the psychology of all this was really interesting, because if you look at what was happening in January and February on Flyer Talk and various places, people were really saying this is a temporary disruption, a sharp shock, and let's get those deals, right? People were snapping up $300 or $400 or $500 business class tickets on revenue to fly in April, thinking, yeah, no problem, that'll be over. Obviously, we're not in that situation anymore, but I think the fundamental principle that people take when they take investment decisions or anything else, right? Be brave when others are fearful, actually still will apply. And the airlines that are going to come out of this are going to come out with aggressive share grabs if they have survived. And if they are going through a bankruptcy, they're going to have to prove a business case, which is based on getting passengers back on board. So they're going to be aggressive. So who's not going to be aggressive once the markets are open? I think there's going to be big opportunities. Watch the expiries. Right now, we're in a funny spot where any hard expiries on airline miles have pretty much been thrown out for a year or two. So actually, your miles are going to be much safer there. Banks have not done that yet. Airlines probably won't devalue. Banks, more likely to devalue. The CFO rules things even more strongly there. And if the airlines choose to pass on costs to the banks will then devalue things like the transfer rates. And we've seen American Express drop Emirates, things like that. You can guess, and I have no insider information here, that that's related to the cost of that program becoming too high. So would I transfer? If I know where I want to go, both literally and figuratively, yes, I would transfer, because I think the airline programs are actually a better place to park the value now than perhaps the bank programs would be. And I would definitely not sacrifice value for security, but everybody's going to be at a different spot on that kind of risk weighting for themselves.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because everyone's looking at the airlines and worrying about them devaluing. No one's really looking at the banks. You mentioned American Express, but just a couple of weeks ago, Bank of China and Singapore announced that they're going to devalue the conversion rate of points to miles. And this is kind of unprecedented because, I mean, I've been doing this for a while. I cannot remember a single time that the bank was the one which devalued the transfer rate. Sometimes they devalue the earn rate, I mean, but that affects your future transfers. This was the first time I saw them doing anything to the conversion rate. So is it possible we're going to see more of that, or even maybe a cutback in terms of sign-up bonuses? I mean, what's the equation now for the banks?
So I don't want to comment on that example specifically. I think you covered it with a lot of subtlety in your editorial about Bank of China. The big thing there was that they made it retroactive, and I think that's not fair play. I think that's less likely. I do think that we have seen in other markets, not necessarily Singapore, but we have seen those conversion rates shift in the past. That's not totally unprecedented, but it's usually done with advance notice. It's usually done with a little bit more of a sense of being consumer friendly than what we've seen just the other month. I don't think you're going to see a trend. This is not a prediction of sweeping devaluations across the industry by any means. But I think that everybody's going to be looking at their P&Ls closely, and banks typically have a lot more levers around where they can put the value to. Chase is a great example in the US, and Amex too, where they've changed the bonus categories because their travel cards, which had very high annual fees, suddenly 90% of the value proposition became irrelevant overnight. So they've had to reconfigure. And I think you'll see those kinds of reconfigurations. They're not always in the consumer's favor, as we well know.
Yeah, so here's an interesting question from Kelvin, right? He's asking whether it's possible that the cost of tickets goes up after COVID-19 because of the potential for social distancing. And just to expand on this a bit more, I know you guys were talking about how, okay, yeah, when the flights start again, the airlines may give great redemption discounts because they need to fill those seats. But the fact of the matter is, if, and this is a very big if, I know the IATA has come out very strongly against this, if social distancing happens and the plane can only be like 2/3 full, that also must mean fewer seats available for redemptions as well, right?
First, I don't think it's feasible, desirable, or very likely that we're going to see social distancing enforced on aircraft. I just don't. We're not going to go back to the days where you had to have your own plane. I think the economics, it would send most successful airlines bust, and the only way that could be avoided is if they double fares, and I don't think people are going to pay that. So unless there's some global regulatory reason, I don't think we're going to see any major carrier, any successful major carrier doing it, aside from maybe more about marketing or ancillaries or positioning for a matter of weeks or months, however long they can sustain it. That said, I think there's going to be there aren't going to be too many people flying initially, but then most airlines are slashing capacity. They're getting rid of old aircraft. They're cutting back on crew, so there's going to be less capacity in the market as well. So I think the end result of all this will be you're going to get a lot more efficient, leaner airlines. I think the pricing initially will be a bit of a basket case. I think you're going to be seeing some crazy promotions out there to stimulate demand, and then you're going to be seeing the CFO intervenes and says, "Look, we need to start making some cash here because otherwise we're going to go bankrupt." So I don't think that this will have a lasting impact on pricing and certainly not on redemption and loyalty, just for those reasons.
Yeah. Okay. Perhaps just a couple more questions. I am mindful we are running out of time very soon. I realized in one of the previous slides we're supposed to talk about Cathay Pacific, but we haven't given them too much airtime here. Any concerns regarding the future of Cathay Pacific specifically? Because we have seen, right? I mean, what was even happening before COVID with the Hong Kong protests, with air traffic down? This seems to be like a double whammy so soon after the first one. Is there any reason for people to be concerned if you are invested in that program?
I think this is another great example. So everybody was worried about Cathay Pacific because they cut their flight schedules by 95%, until suddenly Singapore Airlines cut their flight schedules by 96%. It's not like anybody's coming out of this in great shape. Asia Miles is completely separated. It's an example of best practice program in terms of the structural pieces that Nik was talking about earlier. So am I worried about Asia Miles? Not in the least. Am I worried about Cathay Pacific? Sure, but I'm worried about everybody. I think you could get into an awful lot of political discussion around willingness to invest, the Air China links, the Qatar Airways links, and will they probably find money somewhere? I'd actually say, yeah, I'd bet they're safer than some of the others. But even regardless of that, if Cathay were to go through some form of reorganization or liquidation process, Asia Miles has diversified more effectively than most programs, maybe not at a great value, but they're trying to be a loyalty program that is not dependent on the airline. So I'd actually say that currency is safer than probably 90% of the currencies out there.
It's great to hear for those who are still invested in the program. Okay, we're just going to take one last question. Any other airlines you think are on the bubble or that we should be looking out for, or major loyalty programs that Navy people should think twice before getting in bed with?
That's putting us on the spot a little bit, isn't it? I'm not worried about any loyalty program in isolation from the airline. I'm worried about all the airlines as a collective industry, but also seeing very clearly that the governments acknowledge that we can't have 90% of the world's airlines go bust. I think there's going to be varying structures of bailouts. There's going to be a lot of uncertainty in the industry, but I don't think aviation as we know it is dead forever. And we go back to the 1950s where only the top 3% can fly. That's a very unlikely outcome. And I think that's really the only outcome that represents structural change. Everything else represents a shock for some period of time that will eventually resolve to something that looks not that different from where we are. Now, that may be too optimistic, and we're not getting political, but I think there's a good case to be made that we have to just persevere for another 2 months here in Singapore and for another umpteen months in the rest of the world. And we will come out of this.
Yeah, I saw a great research report, which I was frantically searching for just recently, so I could answer the question with the backing of some data, but I couldn't find it. So, but the report was really looking at airlines that they felt were at risk. And the risk was, could they get financing if they needed it? And were they likely to run out of cash? And the ones with strong balance sheets and in good markets, or where there's either government or they've got very, very strong backers, there's no real concern. Some of the other outliers that are maybe privately funded in countries where governments either don't have interest or don't have the resources to bail them out, then that could be a bigger concern. And that sort of top right quadrant, there were probably 10 airlines in there. The second part that you need to look then is, if it is a high risk airline, then what's the structure related to the loyalty program? Is it in a separate entity? Does it have a separate CEO? Does it exhibit the hallmarks of a program that can survive the airline? Because that reduces your risk again. But at the moment, it is really like looking into a crystal ball, because we don't know what's going to happen. And it's too early to say when and how quickly travel is going to return and where it's going to return, and whether we're going to have bubbles of safe transit between certain markets and so on. So yeah, I think that there's always risk, but I think that it is a double-edged sword, and there are also opportunities out there for those members and customers who are willing to take a few risks. And loyalty and loyalty programs are, at the end of the day, supposed to be fun, and they're supposed to be rewarding. And hopefully they're not the last currency that you have on the earth. So hopefully we'll see most programs coming through this, and more importantly, that members will continue to get value from them, and the shareholders and stakeholders and the airlines can also benefit.
Yep, we hope and pray. All right, I think that's all the time we have. Nik and Mark, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us this evening, as well to everyone who's tuned in. Thank you so much. We are going to do a second session next week, next Thursday as well. That's going to be covering more of the general travel landscape after COVID-19. So do keep a lookout for that. It will be up on the website as well. Thanks again, Mark and Nik, for sharing everything that you know. Let's hope and pray we take back to the sky soon.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you, guys. You have a good evening. Thank you, everyone, as well. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I'm going to log off now.